IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, where we from the Takshashila Institution discuss diverse aspects of public policy. I'm your host Satya, a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution, and I'm today joined by my colleague Saurabh Todi. Saurabh has recently worked on the issue of strategic vulnerabilities that exist in the semiconductor space in India. In today's episode, we will dive into the concept of the strategic technological vulnerability, which by the way refers to the gaps or weaknesses in a country's ability to access or use certain technologies that are vital for its national interests. We will look at some examples of these vulnerabilities, but particularly in the context of global semiconductor industry, which is now facing increasing geopolitical challenges and disruptions as countries and companies alike are moving away from China in their pursuance of their China plus one strategies. We'll also discuss how India can possibly address its own shortfall in this domain and what steps it can possibly take to enhance its capabilities and resilience. Without further ado, let's jump headfirst into the discussion. So, let me start off with your current work, Saurabh. In a framework that you are currently writing, you speak about 3 stages in the life cycle of technologies. These include research and development, standardization and regulation, and commercial deployment. Can you briefly explain how this assessment helped develop a framework for deciding what a vulnerability is? Feel free to use an example about semiconductors.
First of all, thank you for having me, Satya. Yeah, I think if you see it that way, any technology, you could kind of divide it into a life cycle with 3 stages. The first one is the research and development phase, where the technology, is in a very nascent stage. It usually would find its origin in academia or researchers or research institutes doing primary research. When they when the researchers finalize a broad framework, a theoretical framework, then I think the industry then moves on to the next stage. So for example, the language learning processes which we now are more acquainted with, like ChatGPT and everything, those are LLM models are based on the research done on like neural links and artificial neural networks and stuff like that, right? So that is something that you would do in the first stage, which is R&D. Then comes stage which you can broadly call as regulation and standardization. So here, for example, as technology is maturing, as there are more efforts towards commercializing it, efforts are then made by both industry and the government, and also I think somewhat academia, to try to regulate it or at least standardize it in a way that if the product is global, there is some degree of interoperability and ease of using the technology across borders. And then the final stage, I think, which bleeds into this second stage also, is the commercial deployment part, where you have the technology which has been proven to be commercially viable. There are some enabling regulations and standards that then push further adoption of a technology in the broader domain. So broadly, you could classify a technology's life cycle in these 3 broad processes, and obviously each country or a country would have weaknesses and strengths in different aspects of these 3 stages.
Right. So that brings us to the idea of comparative advantage between countries. So, and I suppose this takes on a grander hue when you talk about global value chains, which occur in a very fragmented manner among countries and companies that specialize in each stage of the value chain. So when it comes to semiconductors, how do you say this assessment fares in terms of India's shortfalls of any such vulnerabilities, like India's dependence on any such technology and how it has failed to plug that vulnerability?
So I mean, again, at a very broad level, India did miss out on the research and development aspect because India was not among the top countries doing research on semiconductors. I mean, at least the more cutting edge one. At the same time, because India was not a major player in the semiconductor space, it also did not play as big of a role in the standards that have been set and have been evolving ever since in this domain, as obviously the technology itself matures and becomes more high tech. But if you see, given the move towards supply chain resilience, move away from supply chain issues and the China plus one strategy, India has the opportunity to play a major role in the third aspect, where is commercial deployment. So if you see, the Indian government itself has come out with specific programs and schemes and incentives to incentivize the industry to at least start manufacturing semiconductors. I mean, at first of a much higher size, and then progressively it will become like smaller and smaller. But this is where I think India has an opportunity right now to establish itself at least as a major component of the supply chain for semiconductors.
So on that point, actually, that's very interesting because yes, so India did miss out on the first two aspects of this technology's life cycle. However, there are still initiatives like the RISC-V open architecture, ISA architect, which India is part of, is on the consortium. And India has been incentivizing the production of chips in institutes like IIT, I think Chennai, is it? Who are trying to create homegrown semiconductors and processors using RISC technology to, create essentially in not in leading edge technology and use cases, but in trailing edge like 5G infrastructure or smart devices, etc. So I guess India is trying to still go about the R&D and standardization stages of semiconductor technology, but it has fallen woefully short of being integrated, the objective of being integrated into global supply chains for semiconductors. On that note, actually, let us say that this is a post-facto attempt by India to regulate the strategic vulnerability in technology like this. So what can help formulate India's course of action to ensure that they maintain this strategic autonomy? So speaking for myself, I know that the first and most obvious factor that comes to my mind is any sort of deeper integration into global value chains is necessitated by implementing liberal trade policies. We have seen this with Taiwan, China, Vietnam, Thailand. They have, since the 80s and 90s, they liberalized their tariff policies on input components, intermediate components, even final products. And they focus not simply on consumption for the domestic market, which is pretty huge in China's case, but also for export markets. It is a very targeted manner of governmental intervention. So aside from creating incentives for manufacturing, like India is doing right now with production-linked incentives and other fiscal incentives like tax breaks, the primary reason why these countries began to specialize in their competitive advantage, which is cheaper labor costs and cost competitiveness because of low tariffs, meant that multinational entities were attracted. These entities were dominant in the value chains like AMD, Intel, Qualcomm, who, let's say, decided to come set up shop in that country because it is the most cost competitive for them to set up operations there. What this also resulted in is that local competency in those countries also rose, like engineers, assemblers, resellers, etc. They began to crop up as technology transfer from these companies also trickled down to those host economies, right? So this is possibly also the easiest way in which India can create local competency and acquire technologies, if not for leading edge nodes in manufacturing semiconductors, but at least in trailing edge nodes, or more importantly in assembly and testing, right? That is one of the easiest way in which we use our competitive advantage of highly trained workforce and who are trained in like ITIs and in engineering colleges. Right. Aside from that, this also helps us bridge a technological continuity that we don't have when it comes to developing a semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem. What we do have is a fairly robust chip design sector. I think around 20% of the world's leading chips, designed in India, but all of that IP is still in the hands of multinational entities like NVIDIA and Intel. So in case we do create the assembly and manufacturing ecosystem by lowering tariffs, implementing liberal trade policies, alongside our PLI schemes, attracting these companies, will probably help create like a forward linkage to that design ecosystem, right? We can have homegrown design companies be able to competitively manufacture, design chips and then be able to manufacture and package and sell in India or for export markets. So, I mean, I suppose this implementing a zero tariff regime for inputs and services, which are necessary for different stages of value addition, we can possibly use up the positions of China, Vietnam, and Thailand in the global semiconductor value chain. But do you think this approach can necessarily make up for the lost opportunity for India when it came to setting standards and regulation? Like that is the entire reason why the value chain is now currently fragmented. And are there any lessons for us when it comes to any other emerging technology?
I do agree broadly. I think in this one example is also important, that when we talk about, like just doing assembly and lack of human capital and everything, but it is a like long drawn process. Like for example, China, it was like an assembler in the very initial stages of its growth, right? In industry and all, like a lot of technology, either emerging or the standard one in which China has dominance now, it only has that dominance because at first it was part of the lower end of the value chain. And then as it gained more expertise, obviously, it's more complicated, but as it gained more expertise, spent more money in R&D, it was able to, like bridge that gap of not having enough R&D. And then obviously when you have R&D, when you do more research, when you contribute to development of technology, then you automatically, in some cases, would be able to influence the regulation and standards around that technology. So I think we should not be dismissing the fact that we are just catching up onto the third stage of this life cycle, because as India would produce more, manufacture more, even if it is just assembly or like as you said, as part of the global supply chains, we should it is possible that we will build human capital and expertise within India, which then can contribute to R&D and regulations down the line.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Okay, yeah, so that brings me to a good point. So China did actually very specifically target manufacturing and governmental schemes to ensure that information and communication technology consumer products were targeted. That specifically built capacity for those back in the 80s and 90s, so that by now, like they are the indisputable world leader in that. It is extremely difficult to do so. Barring that point, when you talk about human capital being the linchpin for any sort of research and development activity in a country, what kind of factors do you think enable the free movement of human capital between, let's say, collaborating countries and transferring technology or expertise, creating competency between academic institutions, for example? Or the other example that comes to my mind, sorry for bringing in trade again in this, is that free trade agreements between countries like, let's say, Taiwan and India. Like, for instance, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation is incentivized to come set up a plant in India. And while doing so, the technology transfer that occurs because of technology demonstration, like they say that they provide instructions on how to operate lithography equipment, like deep extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment in India, where India has a zero experience, I think, as of now. That is going to trickle down, right? So is there any other way in which human capital can be developed, so to speak, in a context where India is still playing catch up?
When we're playing catch up, obviously I think we have to rely on the external sources, because anything that you will do internally, for example, this is very basic. For example, if you want to improve your human capital, it has to start with very basics, health and education. That's at the level of just high quality human capital. But on top of that, the quality of education in our colleges and universities, the amount of collaboration between industry and academia for what industry wants, what academia has, and that their dialogue between the two. And then obviously the presence of actual money, right? Like funding for primary R&D, whether it is public or private. All of these are very important. All these take shape together, but these are long-term bets, right? You can't just throw money at something and then expect that the workforce that you have will magically improve overnight. So this is a long process, but as a stopgap measure, I think being able to collaborate with your partners and to be able to work with them we'll be able to bridge the gap, at least for time being. So yeah, I think that's one thing that we can do at least.
Okay, so we have explored the very first stage in the life cycle of technology, which is research and development. We also understand what it might take to catch up in the commercial deployment aspect of it. It's still shrouded in mystery because of geopolitical reasons, I suppose. But when it comes to standardization and regulation, Okay, in my limited experience of this particular aspect, standardization and regulation usually follows from the industry creating, like, the market forces deciding a market leader, and then that possibly being regulated by the government. But when it comes to technologies, like, let's say, in India, for instance, the United Payments Interface, that is the way in which you make payments throughout the country across any other platform, something that has no other country has done until India did. That may not be strategic in the sense that it's not reliant on it, but the regulation there was came preemptively before the actual deployment of the technology into the public. Right, so the government created the National Payments Corporation of India, before which then started launching this platform. So in this case, when you did mention that none of the stages are necessarily linear and there can be overlaps, but do you think that this is a trend that we'll continue to see in any sort of emerging technologies? Because even in the case of green technologies, where the government might try to, let's say, push for greater adoption of electric vehicles and charging infrastructure because it wants to combat climate change or meet its SDG goals and carbon reduction goals. So, do you think that we'll probably end up seeing more examples of preemptive regulation and standardization before market leaders come into play?
I mean, I would not say it that way. I don't think I would call it like a preemptive regulation, because, I mean, before you regulate something, you need to know what exactly that is, right? And so I think when I am saying about, like R&D, it is very basic primary R&D. You would not even have something in the market until you have that R&D. So like I'm talking more about at that level. So you have to have that proof of concept.
Right.
That proof of concept aspect is the primary R&D. And then, I mean, even regulations, I mean, they're also not also right linear. So you have some technology, it starts to get adopted, there are more market players, and once you reach a threshold of user base or at least familiarity, that is when like the need for standards and regulation starts to happen. And then it becomes like a process where it is more like a dialogue between industry, academia, and the government, mostly because it is the one regulating. But then that is where all these cogs, like of the wheel kind of come together. So I would say that not preemptive regulation, but the pace of regulation would have to increase, or at least the regulations have to be a lot more flexible, because the pace at which technologies are evolving, and we are seeing more and more new use cases of technologies and new brand new technologies from scratch, regulations usually play like a catch up to technologies which are emerging. So, but I think the pace of that catch up will only accelerate. So one thing could be to actually don't have a very restrictive set of regulations which actually turn to maybe reduce the pace of innovation, but make regulations which are light touch, but also like they are more enabling. They reduce the restrictive aspect and they facilitate the aspect where they allow for greater innovation. So regulatory sandboxes are one of the examples, and UPA came out of it.
Yeah.
So these, I think, attempts, I think, should be made, and I think they are being made. But I think that's just the nature of pace of technology and regulation, that regulation would usually always play catch up to the technologies of the day.
Right. On that note, so I understand the regulatory sandboxes and piloting of those are pretty viable in a domestic landscape when you're developing technology, domestically speaking. The angle of maintaining strategic autonomy or superiority in while doing that domestically may or may not be at the forefront. But when we're looking at, let's say, an international consortium of countries or organizations which are trying to come up with after the research part is done, trying to come up with a set of standards and ideas of governance of technology internationally. Like I already mentioned the case of RISC-V, which is there's an open source instruction set architecture for microprocessors. And India is on the board of consortium. But how would India be what kind of angle can India take to maintain its strategic autonomy when it comes to negotiations, creation of standards on forums like this?
I mean, it really depends on the relative strength of that technology, of India in the technology, right? So if the technology is pretty emerging, it's new, it's still taking shape, and India has no role in trying to produce the technology, do R&D. So I think India's say would be very limited, right? I guess as being like a big consumer and like big country with global presence, there, I mean, India would still have a say, but that, like, its say would be more like not as the active producer or consumer of the technology. So I think the vulnerability aspect here is that if there is a technology which has like significant implications to the economic security and national security of the country, then that technology would be considered as critical, and then you would have to like take steps to reduce the vulnerability that comes from the technology, either that is through dependence on others, or it is through like not having enough regulation or not having enough say, that is very dependent on the context of the technology and the strength of India in that domain.
Right. So in order for India to have any sort of not bargaining, but let's say negotiating power at the table on international forums like this, India. So is it a viable way to first become part of existing value chains and then use that integration as a bargaining chip?
Yeah, I mean,
like that, right?
yeah, I mean, I'll not say even like bargaining. I mean, the point here is that people, I mean, why should somebody like listen to India on a technology, right? Because India has taken it. At stake would either be the one that, okay, I am the one who produced the technology, or I am the one who am making the technology, or I'm the one who consumes the technology. In all of those three, I mean, these trends are different, right? For research, there's more IP. For consumers, you're less, because, at the end, you're the consumer. So, I mean, obviously, it's a more complex debate. But the point here is that you will have more say when you have skin in the game. And skin in the game could be as an innovator, as a manufacturer, or as a consumer. But unless you have any of these three, I think it would be very difficult for India to voice its stand in global regulatory bodies, because, again, you have to have stake in that technology's success or effect for you to do something about it.
Right. So before we end this, so in the context of all that we discussed, what would be a very easy definition of, well, not easy, sorry, very simplistic definition of a strategic technological vulnerability for our listeners to understand?
I would say that, again, to reiterate, if any technology which has significant impact, either to accelerate or to negatively impact any impact on economic security or national security of a country, that technology can be termed as critical, and the relative position of, let's say, India in that technology ecosystem would be considered a vulnerability if you are not part of the ecosystem of the technology.
Right. Thank you so much, Saurabh. That is all the time for today. And Saurabh's insights have proved immensely helpful in understanding what the idea of strategic technological vulnerability is, and particularly in the semiconductor ecosystem, which, by the way, we have a limited series coming up on All Things Policy soon. So please stay tuned. And I'm sure the listeners have gotten a very good idea of what the discussion implies. This is all for today's episode, folks. See you on the next episode.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.